The air over the parade ground at Fort Draken was not merely hot, it was a physical weight. It was a solid, shimmering thing that pressed down on the helmets and shoulders of the 3,000 soldiers standing in rigid formation, their collective presence a vast geometric tapestry of olive drab and tightly controlled energy. The sun was a merciless white disk in a bleached-out sky, baking the asphalt until it smelled of tar and simmering resentment. This was the final review before Operation Serpent's Coil, the largest deployment this division had seen in a decade, and the atmosphere was thick with the silent, anxious hum of men and women preparing to step into the unknown. They were a weapon being sharpened, and the grinding stone was the voice of the man on the reviewing stand. Colonel Marcus Thorne was the center of this universe. He stood behind the podium, a figure carved from granite and hubris, his uniform so crisply starched it seemed capable of stopping a blade. His chest was a billboard for his own achievements, a constellation of ribbons and polished brass that caught the brutal sunlight and threw it back with arrogant defiance. His voice, amplified by a public address system that seemed to strain under its power, was not a voice so much as a geological event. It was a rockslide of command, of certainty, of an ego so vast it had its own gravitational pull. He held the attention of 3,000 souls in the palm of his hand, and he savored the weight of it. To Marcus Thorne, the world was a simple brutalist structure, a ladder of dominance where one climbed by planting a polished boot on the face of the person below. He saw strength in volume, authority in posture, and respect as something to be demanded, not earned. These soldiers standing in their perfect rows were not individuals to him. They were not sons and daughters, not thinkers or dreamers. They were a monolith, a singular testament to his power. They were 3,000 mirrors reflecting his own importance, and the image they showed him was intoxicating. He believed leadership was a performance, and he was, in his own mind, giving the performance of a lifetime. The heat, the tension, the sheer scale of the moment, it was all a stage set for him, and him alone. His words rolled over the silent ranks, a sermon of fire and duty delivered by a man who had long ago fallen in love with the sound of his own voice. He spoke of sacrifice, of honor, of the warrior's spirit, but his internal monologue was a much simpler, more primal chant: look at me, listen to me, fear me. It was this consuming need for the world to conform to his vision of order that made him notice the anomaly. At the base of the reviewing stand, just to the left of the stairs, was a smudge, an imperfection in the grand portrait of his power. A figure was crouched there, a small, indistinct shape that did not belong. He narrowed his eyes, his booming oration continuing on autopilot while a sliver of his mind focused on this discordant note. It was a woman, he realized, and she was not in uniform. She was dressed in a faded gray hoodie, the hood down, and a pair of practical pocketed cargo pants that had seen better days. She looked like a lost civilian, a piece of misplaced luggage, utterly insignificant. This was Dr. Eris Thorne. She was kneeling on the hot asphalt, her attention focused with laser-like intensity on an open junction box for the very PA system that was currently broadcasting the colonel's tirade across the field. A small, high-resolution diagnostic tool was plugged into one of the ports, its screen displaying cascading lines of code that only she could understand. Her movements were a study in economy, each twist of a screwdriver, each tap on the screen, performed with a liquid precision that was entirely at odds with her disheveled appearance. She was an island of profound monastic calm in a sea of restless military energy. The colonel's voice, a physical force that made the air vibrate, seemed to part around her, unable to penetrate the bubble of intense concentration in which she worked. She was a silent gray rock in the middle of a roaring river, unmoved and seemingly unaware of the current. Colonel Thorne's mind, which processed the world in terms of threats and subordinates, categorized her instantly. Weakness, irrelevance, disrespect. The sheer audacity of her presence, of her quiet focus on some mundane task while he, Colonel Marcus Thorne, was delivering a speech to 3,000 warriors, was an affront. It was a tiny tear in the fabric of his authority, and his entire worldview dictated that such tears must be violently mended. His speech faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw her, kneeling in the dirt, and decided she would be his object lesson for the day. He would use her to demonstrate the price of insignificance. He would make an example of her quiet defiance, and in doing so, reinforce the foundations of his own kingdom of noise. He stopped speaking. The abrupt silence was more shocking than the loudest command. The flow of his voice had been a constant pressure, and its sudden absence created a vacuum that pulled every eye towards the reviewing stand. 3,000 pairs of eyes, which had been fixed forward in glassy-eyed obedience, now blinked and refocused, sensing a shift in the drama. They saw their colonel, his face a thundercloud, step away from the podium. They saw him turn and begin to descend the stairs, his polished boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate, menacing weight. His sycophant, Major Kent, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically replaced with a hinge, scurried down after him, a loyal shadow to his master's rage. The collective gaze of the entire formation followed him, a massive, silent spotlight that swung from the powerful colonel to the small, kneeling woman who seemed utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break over her head. Thorn came to a stop before her, his large frame casting a long, sharp shadow that swallowed her whole. He loomed, a mountain of starched fabric and self-importance, waiting for her to flinch, to look up, to show the proper deference. She did not. She continued to watch the lines of code scroll across her screen, her focus absolute. The seconds stretched into a tense, unbearable eternity. Finally, Thorn broke the silence. His voice, stripped of the microphone's amplification, was a low, condescending growl, meant only for her, but carrying to the first few ranks of soldiers who were now straining to hear. "Lost, little bird." Aris didn't respond. She made one final adjustment with a pair of delicate pliers, her movements as steady as a surgeon's. Thorn's lip curled. The snickers he had anticipated from the front ranks began to ripple through the silence, a welcome sound to his ears. He gestured vaguely at her worn hoodie. "I think you're in the wrong place, sweetheart. The civilian contractor orientation is on the other side of the base, unless you're looking for the mess hall. It's easy to get turned around on a post this size." He was performing now for the soldiers, his voice dripping with false concern that barely masked its cruel mockery. Major Kent chuckled on cue, a dry, rasping sound. He then leaned in, glancing at the small, laminated ID clipped to her belt. His eyes widened in theatrical disbelief. "Thorn!" he barked, a harsh laugh escaping him. "Well, what are the odds? A cosmic joke. Don't go telling people we're related, techie. I have a reputation to maintain." Only then, after she had finished her task, did Aris move. She unplugged her diagnostic tool and methodically coiled its wire. She rose to her feet in a single, fluid motion, her small frame seeming impossibly fragile next to the colonel's bulk. She wiped a small smudge of grease from the back of her hand onto her cargo pants and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were a calm, neutral gray, devoid of fear, anger, or any discernible emotion. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, flat, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a machine stating a fact. The system was throwing an error. That was all. 2 sentences. A simple statement of fact that carried no apology, no explanation, no deference. It was the devastating simplicity of her response that sent a jolt through Thorn's carefully constructed edifice of ego. He had expected fear, stammering, perhaps even tears. He had built a stage for a public humiliation, and his intended victim had refused to read her lines. Her profound, unshakable calm was not weakness, it was a mirror, and the reflection it showed him was of a large, loud man shouting at a rock. It infuriated him. His face flushed a deep mottled red. The brittle shell of his authority, so dependent on the fear and compliance of others, began to crack under the pressure of her indifference. He saw her silence not as peace, but as a profound act of rebellion. He needed to reassert control, to shatter that unnerving stillness. He jabbed a thick finger toward the silent, watching ranks of soldiers. "You see them?" he boomed, his voice rising again, desperate to reclaim its power. "You see these 3,000 warriors? They are the tip of the spear. They are the wall upon which our enemies break. Their lives depend on flawless execution, on a chain of command that is absolute. What could a little technician, a grease monkey in a hoodie, possibly know about what it takes to command them? To build them? He took a half-step forward, invading her personal space, his chest puffed out like a preening bird of prey. To punctuate his point, to physically impose his will upon her, he reached out and placed a heavy proprietary hand on her shoulder. It was meant as a gesture of final dismissive dominance. Crack! The sound was not a crack of bone, but of electricity. A deafening, piercing screech of feedback erupted from every speaker on the parade ground, a sound like the sky being torn in half. The soldiers flinched as one, hands flying to their ears. The screech lasted for 3 agonizing seconds before cutting out into an absolute, profound silence. The PA system was dead, but it was worse than that. Simultaneously, on the mobile command console set up near the reviewing stand, a bank of lights flickered from steady green to frantic, flashing red. A young communications sergeant stared at his screen, his face draining of all color. "Sir!" the sergeant yelled, his voice thin with panic. "Comms are down! All channels! The entire exercise network just collapsed!" Colonel Thorne's head snapped towards the console. He barked a series of useless orders, his voice now a raw, unamplified thing, swallowed by the vastness of the parade ground. "Get it back up! Reroute! What's the status of the backup relay?" But his words were just noise. The intricate web of communication that held his entire operation together had simply vanished. A ripple of confusion and nascent panic began to spread through the command staff. In the modern army, a unit without communications was not a unit at all. It was just a crowd of armed and isolated people. Through it all, Aris remained still. She seemed to pay no mind to the heavy hand that was still, absurdly, resting on her shoulder. With the same unnerving calm, she turned back to the open junction box. Thorne, distracted by the catastrophe, had loosened his grip. She shrugged his hand off as easily as if it were a piece of lint. Her own hands, which had been so methodical just moments before, now became a blur of motion. She produced the small diagnostic tool from her pocket again, but this time she also retrieved a custom-made interface cable and a device no larger than a credit card, which she slotted into a hidden port inside the panel. Her fingers danced across the small keypad of her tool, her eyes fixed on the screen. It was not the work of a repairman fumbling with wires. It was the fluid, confident performance of a master artisan who knew her instrument down to its fundamental particles. It was the grace of a concert pianist playing a piece of impossible complexity, of a surgeon performing a life-saving operation against a ticking clock. The soldiers in the front ranks, the command staff, even Major Kent, all stood mesmerized, their own crisis forgotten as they watched this impossible display of focused competence. The feat that followed was not merely impressive, it was, by all known standards, impossible. She was not just fixing the dead PA system. The lines of code scrolling on her screen showed she was doing something far more profound. She was diving deep into the core architecture of the entire base's tactical network. She identified the catastrophic node failure, isolated it, and then, instead of attempting a reboot, she began to write new code on the fly. She was weaving a new net, rerouting terabytes of data, bypassing the damaged hardware entirely by creating a redundant, self-correcting mesh network using the very signals that were supposed to be offline. She was building a new nervous system for the entire army base in real time. 28 seconds. Ping. The red lights on the command console blinked once, twice, and then turned a solid, reassuring green. Every single one of them. The young sergeant stared, his mouth hanging open. A moment later, a voice, perfectly clear and free of static, came through every speaker on the parade ground simultaneously. Network integrity restored, all channels operational, latency is at 0.01%, the new architecture is stable. It was her voice, flat, technical, emotionless. A silence deeper and more profound than any that had come before descended upon the parade ground. It was a silence born not of obedience, but of pure, unadulterated shock. 3,000 soldiers stood in slack-jawed astonishment, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Colonel Thorne's face, which had been a mask of rage, was now a perfect blank. It was the face of a man whose entire understanding of the world had been picked up, shaken violently, and shattered on the floor. His worldview had no category for what had just happened. The snickering of the troops was a distant, shameful memory, replaced by a growing murmur of disbelief and awe. Iris showed no sign of triumph, no flicker of emotion. The impossible feat she had just performed was, to her, simply a problem that had been solved. She calmly disconnected her tools, tucked them neatly back into the pockets of her cargo pants, and reached for the cover of the junction box, preparing to screw it back into place as if she had just finished changing a light bulb. The grand drama of the moment was utterly irrelevant to her. The work was done. It was into this tableau of stunned silence and dawning revelation that a new element arrived. A convoy of 3 black unmarked sedans had approached the edge of the parade ground with a quiet, purposeful urgency that bespoke immense authority. They rolled to a stop without a sound. The rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and from it emerged a man whose presence was a physical force, a gravitational field that instantly bent the reality of the parade ground around him. He was tall and lean, his uniform immaculate but understated. It was the 4 stars glittering on his collar that commanded total instant obedience. It was General Sterling, commander of the entire United States Army Forces Command, a living legend who was supposed to be 1,000 miles away. General Sterling's steel-gray eyes swept the scene in a single, all-encompassing glance. He took in the 3,000 frozen soldiers, the flustered command staff, the pale and speechless Colonel Thorne, and finally, the small woman in the gray hoodie who was calmly tightening a screw on a junction box. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He walked not to the reviewing stand, but directly onto the asphalt, his stride eating up the distance between him and Colonel Thorne. His voice when he spoke was not loud. It did not need to be. It was like the cracking of glacial ice, quiet, sharp, and absolutely unstoppable. Colonel Thorne. Report! Thorne snapped to a semblance of attention, his body moving out of pure reflex while his mind was still reeling. General, he stammered, his voice a pathetic croak. Sir, we had a temporary communications failure. The situation is under control. Sterling's gaze was withering. I know what you had, Colonel. I was monitoring the exercise network from my command jet when it suddenly ceased to exist. I then saw it come back online, not just restored, but rebuilt from the ground up on a signal architecture I have not seen deployed since the Onyx Directive, an architecture that is classified far above your pay grade. He took another step closer, his eyes boring into Thorne's. So, you will explain to me, in very small words, why you appear to be publicly harassing my chief architect for that directive. The title hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Chief architect. Thorne's face went from pale to ghostly white. The general did not wait for an answer. He turned his back on the now trembling colonel, a dismissal more profound than any verbal rebuke, and walked the final few feet to where Eris was finishing her work. When he spoke to her, his voice had changed completely. The glacial coldness was gone, replaced by a tone of low, weary, and profound respect. Dr. Thorne, Eris, I apologize for my subordinate's lack of professional courtesy. I should have known better than to let him run this review without a proper briefing. Eris gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. The network had a flaw in its primary relay controller. It was bound to fail under a full load. It's fixed now. Sterling nodded slowly, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He then turned to face the entire silent formation. He stood beside the unassuming woman in the hoodie, and his voice, now filled with the clear, ringing authority of high command, carried across the vast, silent field. For those of you who do not know, he began, his voice a hammer striking the anvil of truth, and that appears to be everyone here, including your colonel, this is Dr. Eris Thorne. She is not a technician, she's not a contractor. She holds a position in the Department of Defense, so specialized it doesn't have a formal rank. She is the mind that designed the Wraith encrypted communication system that every single one of you uses to this day. She wrote the core training doctrine for the Signal Corps Academy. The brutal final stress tests in your training, the ones 90% of you failed the first time, she authored them. The unbreakable encryption that protects your messages, She broke it 100 times during development just to prove it could be done. A wave of murmurs, of dawning comprehension, swept through the ranks of soldiers. They were staring at her now, not as an object of mockery, but as if she were a ghost. The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle. There are men and women in the special operations community who owe their lives to her. During the Onyx Directive, a name some of you older sergeants here might remember with a shiver, she went by a call sign. He looked at Aris. Her call sign was Weaver, because in the middle of the worst firefights, when all comms were down and teams were cut off and about to be overrun, she would weave ghosts out of thin air. She would build them signals from nothing and guide them home through the fire. She is, and I do not engage in hyperbole, the sole reason that half the people in this theater command are still alive today. He let that final, stunning revelation hang in the hot, still air. Then, General Sterling, the four-star commander of the most powerful army in the world, a man who had the careers of thousands in his hands, turned to fully face the small, quiet woman in the faded gray hoodie. He straightened his back, clicked his heels together, and brought his hand up to his brow in the sharpest, most impeccably executed salute Colonel Thorne had ever witnessed. It was not a salute from a superior to a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, ultimate respect. It was the salute of a warrior to a master, of a king to the architect of his kingdom. The world of Colonel Marcus Thorne did not just crack, it disintegrated. It became dust and blew away on the hot desert wind. In that single silent gesture from the general, Thorne's career, his identity, his entire blustering worldview, was publicly executed. General Sterling formally relieved him of his command on the spot, his words quiet and clinical, like a doctor pronouncing a time of death. Thorne offered no defense. He was a hollow man, his bellowing authority reduced to a choked, whispered, "Yes, sir." He would be reassigned to a desk in a windowless room deep in the Pentagon, a ghost in the vast machine he once deluded himself into thinking he commanded. His humiliation was not just total, it was biblical. A different kind of ripple now moved through the 3,000 soldiers. It was a wave of collective understanding, of awe, and of a deep vicarious shame for their earlier complicity, for their thoughtless snickers. They were looking at a living legend, a ghost from the whispered stories of the old wars made flesh. Their entire conception of strength, of authority, of what a warrior looked like, had been irrevocably recalibrated. The big, loud man was a fraud. The small, quiet woman was a giant. It was a lesson none of them would ever forget. If you believe true respect is earned through quiet competence, not demanded with loud authority, type respect in the comments. Aris, for her part, seemed almost weary of the ceremony. She accepted the general's salute not with a return gesture, but with a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head, the barest minimum of acknowledgement. Her focus had already moved on. She turned to the young, shell-shocked communications sergeant who was still staring at his flawless console. "Check the primary heatsink on relay 4, she said, her voice its usual flat monotone. "It's running 3 degrees hot. The new architecture will hold, but flag it for physical replacement after the exercise." And with that, she was done. She picked up the small, worn backpack that had been lying at the base of the stand, slung it over one shoulder, and simply walked away. She didn't look back at the general, at the broken colonel, or at the thousands of soldiers who now watched her with a reverence usually reserved for saints. She just walked, a small gray figure moving toward the heat haze, shimmering at the edge of the airfield, disappearing into it as quietly and unobtrusively as she had appeared. The story of that day spread like wildfire. It became a legend, a piece of institutional folklore at Fort Draken. It was the story of the day Colonel Thorne's career was ended by a quiet woman in a hoodie. Seasoned master sergeants told it to cocky new lieutenants as a cautionary tale. Drill instructors whispered it to recruits to teach them that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice last. The legend of the Weaver became a teaching tool, a permanent reminder that ego is a fragile shield, while competence is a sword of tempered steel. Years passed. In a quiet classroom at a military academy, a civilian instructor named Marcus Thorne stood before a class of young, eager officer candidates. He was a different man now. The bluster was gone, replaced by a deep, weary quiet. His shoulders were slumped, the fire in his eyes long since extinguished and replaced by the embers of hard-won wisdom. He was teaching a lesson on leadership, and he told them a story. "I once knew a colonel," he began, his voice low and steady, "a man who thought his rank made him a king. He made the fatal mistake of judging a book by its cover, of confusing silence for weakness. He learned that day that real power doesn't need to shout." He never used his own name, but the shame and humility were etched so deeply into his face that the story felt more real than any textbook. Far away, in the hushed, climate-controlled quiet of a university research lab, Eris Thorne leaned over the shoulder of a promising graduate student. She pointed to a flaw in a line of code, her voice the same flat, technical monotone. "Your logic loop is inefficient here. It creates a recursive drain." She was mentoring a new generation, building new things, solving new problems. She was utterly indifferent to the legends that followed in her wake. The past was a series of solved equations. Her focus, as always, was on the problem that was right in front of her, the work that still needed to be done. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in our culture about the nature of strength. We are taught to see it in the grandiose gesture, to hear it in the booming voice, to recognize it in the polished insignia of rank and station. We build edifices of authority, carefully constructed shells of title and uniform, to project an image of power. We do this in the military, in corporate boardrooms, in the halls of government, and even in our own families. These structures are built to command respect, to demand attention, to create a hierarchy that places us safely at the top. But so often, these structures are brittle. They are hollow, designed not to project strength, but to protect a deep and fragile insecurity. The loudest person in the room is often the most terrified. True strength, true mastery, has no need for such performance. It is a quiet tectonic force that exists independent of recognition. It is the deep, unshakable confidence that comes from competence. It is the calm of the master surgeon who does not boast of her skill, but simply enters the operating theater and saves a life. It is the silence of the master engineer who does not need to explain the brilliance of her design, but simply builds the bridge that carries a nation. This strength is not about dominance, it is about effect. It does not seek to control people, it seeks to solve problems. It is the difference between the hollow thunder of a passing storm and the silent, irresistible power of a river carving its way through stone. The world is full of people like Colonel Thorne, people who mistake their position for their worth, their volume for their value. They build their kingdoms on the shifting sands of ego, demanding loyalty but never truly earning it. And the world is also full of people like Eris Thorne. They are the quiet professionals, the hidden masters, the unassuming figures in the background who are the true architects of our world. They are the IT specialist who keeps the entire company running while the CEO gives speeches. They are the quiet janitor who knows the secrets of a building better than the architect who designed it. They are the librarian who holds the keys to 1,000 worlds but never raises her voice. These are the people who possess a power that cannot be stripped away with a demotion or a change in title, for their power resides within them. It is the indestructible power of knowing what to do and how to do it. The ultimate lesson, then, is one of perception. It is a call to look past the uniform, to listen beneath the noise, to value substance over style. It is a reminder that respect is a currency that cannot be demanded at gunpoint. It can only be earned through the quiet, consistent, and undeniable demonstration of competence. The salutes that matter are not those given out of fear of rank, but those given out of pure, unadulterated awe for a skill so profound it borders on magic. We must learn to see the weavers among us, for they are the ones who are truly holding our world together, one quiet, perfect, and invisible stitch at a time. If you think people often judge what they do not understand, comment, "That is unfair." We must train ourselves to recognize that true authority is not worn on a collar. It is held in the calm, steady hands of those who can, when everything has fallen apart, simply and quietly put it all back together again.